In 1991, 22 CNA field reps deployed to the Middle East to support Operation Desert Storm. These are their stories. Welcome to Analysis in Combat. I'm John Stimson. August 2nd, 1990. Iraqi troops invade Kuwait, sweep aside its army, and occupy the nation. To deter further aggression, President George H.W. Bush deploys the Marines to Saudi Arabia. Some forces board amphibious ships, which will arrive in the Persian Gulf over 5 weeks later. But the 7th Marine Expeditionary Brigade deploys using a novel approach, never before tested in wartime. Just 12 days later, the unit's 15,000 Marines, flanked by their tanks, helicopters, and artillery, are in position and ready for combat. On this episode of Analysis in Combat, how the Maritime Pre-Positioning Forces ensures that the Marines remain America's first force, able to deploy anywhere at any time.
My name is Bill Morton. I started at CNA in 1969. I spent not quite 50 years as a full-time employee and worked on a variety of issues over my career. One of the things great about CNA is, given the breadth of CNA, is you can work on a lot of different things, which amounts to a different job without being required to move employers. And I did that quite frequently. But today we're going to talk a little bit about maritime pre-positioning, which had equipment, vehicles, and supplies stored on ships that would sail to an area. The Marines would fly to the area, take receipt of the vehicles and supplies as they came off the ship, marry up, and become combat ready.
And these ships were pre-positioned, right? Hence maritime pre-positioning forces. They would sail to their designated area around the globe far ahead of time, right? And in this case, that was the Indian Ocean. And so they could very quickly arrive in the theater and marry up with the Marines. So the Marines could be ready for combat much quicker than if they sailed in the traditional way aboard an amphibious ship. And CNA was involved in this process and this effort for a long time, right? This is a massive project that we had a lot of involvement in, correct?
That's correct. It ran from sometime in the 70s when the initial concept development started. CNA was involved. The actual roots of this go back to the Iranian hostage crisis and our inability to move forces quickly into that region. So that's kind of where it started. CNA was involved in the initial design and concept development, and we evolved from that through additional studies. And then eventually in the mid-'80s, when the maritime pre-positioning ships started to come online and we began to exercise, the Navy and Marine Corps began to exercise those. CNA was in the middle of all that as data collection and analysis support for the people involved.
And when do you enter this story?
I actually entered the story sometime in the early 1980s. The concept had been developed, but it was a big deal for both the Navy and the Marine Corps, and there was a fair amount of money involved in it. So I became involved in it when the Admiral asked CNA to look at the concept and see if we could do anything that would identify any shortfalls in it, any ways to improve it, and that sort of thing. It was sort of, take a hard look at this and see what you think is right and what you think is wrong and make recommendations for it. And that's when I became involved. So, and one of the things that seemed like it was problematic at the time was that the concept relied on heavy lift aircraft. In those days, it was the C-5 to transport and move the 53 helicopters that were the only vertical lift that was associated with that concept. There weren't many C-5s at the time, and they had a horrible maintenance record. So that looked like a concern. Troops also were all going to fly in on C-141s or the equivalent of them.
These are troop transport planes, just to clarify.
Right, correct. Troop transport planes, combination of cargo or otherwise. So it could also just be commercial aircraft if you could get them to fly into a combat zone. But that looked a little less problematic, but still you were relying on airlift in your position in the line, because airlift is one of the things that's quite constrained when you start deploying to forward areas.
And is it constrained due to vulnerability or due to the need for a landing zone, or what is the reason?
I mean, that was the primary way most forces deployed, other than the Navy. And so you were standing in line trying to hitch a ride. One of the early things in the concept tied to airlift was a question about tanks and whether they should be pre-positioned or flown in. And I'll never forget one general said, "Man, if you're licking airmail stamps for a tank, you're not in a very good position." So those definitely went on the ship, but it was just a way to see if we could do something with a design that would include troop berthing and space for helicopters. And so that was the main piece that we were looking at the time.
And was it ultimately accepted by the Marine Corps?
No. Recall when I started, I said there was already a design, and the Navy and Marine Corps were moving ahead. They hadn't quite signed the leases for the ships, but they were close. The designs were filled, and so the contracts that would have led to the construction of those ships or the modification of them was near at hand. And so the Navy was actually quite interested in the design and a change in the concept, and was willing to spend more money for the ships. Many of the Marines thought it was a good idea, but it was just too late to the table because they already had one, and they were very concerned that if they chased a better idea, that there was a risk they would lose everything. And so they were saying, yes, we agree it would be better, but this is good enough and it's certain. The existing design is going to happen. Now, one of the pieces that's not well understood about that process and the project was that we also identified things that were not included, things that were standard in a Marine Air Ground Task Force that were not included in the concept, like 46 helicopters. 46 is a medium lift helicopter the Marines had for years and years. It was their primary troop carrier, kind of a workhorse of a standard Marine Air Ground Task Force, and it was not part of it. And aircraft maintenance was not part of it. And so we actually identified something when we would brief this that would say, here's what's on the ship, here's what's going to fly in, and here's what you're going to leave behind. And the piece that actually resonated a lot with virtually all the Marines was the identification of what was going to be left behind and how they fixed that.
It just really speaks to the value of having an outside perspective in the conversation, even if all that does is force the organization to confront what they've been thinking and what kind of doctrine they've been following, and wonder if that's actually the best approach and what changes need to be made.
Absolutely. And I think, one of CNA's great strengths is that we were close enough to them that we've always been trusted. Our views are, whether they're accepted or not accepted, they're valued.
Mm-hmm.
Valued for the discussions that go on around them. And so I think you're absolutely right.
Well, I want to move on and talk about the testing and evaluation part of your work on this. So, as I understand it, you actually did step away from this project for a few years and then come back to it. So now we're looking at finding out, how do we actually implement this? Can you talk a bit about what goes into putting together an exercise with the Navy and the Marine Corps to test something like this and what that actually looks like?
We were the driver for the data collection and analysis, but the Navy and Marine Corps actually did all the heavy lifting for putting the exercises together.
Mm-hmm.
And we would be a support arm and work with them and then show up and collect data. So sometime around the mid 80s, I think 85 maybe or thereabouts, there were ships that had come online. They had been loaded with Marine Corps vehicles, and it had 30 days of supplies. And the Marines wanted to explore how this concept would actually work in practice. And so we began. There were two ways you could offload a ship. One was in port and one was at sea. There was never any real concern about what would happen if you could get it into a port. What was less certain was what happened if you had to unload these ships at sea and transport the vehicles and containers with all their supplies to the beach and get it to the beach where you could marry it up with Marines. So every exercise that I was involved in involved what was known as an in-stream offload. That meant the ship was anchored off the beach. You had to use the Navy lighterage, the barge ferries, the LCUs, the small craft, to transfer vehicles and containers from the ship where it was offloaded by a crane onto some piece of lighterage to get it to the beach where it was offloaded.
And this is a pretty significant logistical challenge, to be clear, right? We're talking about like the effort that it would take to empty a warehouse, but a warehouse that's floating in the middle of a harbor or entering a port. It isn't an insignificant thing.
No, it wasn't. And the one of the key pieces that we were testing in all of this were some of the initial assumptions, both big assumptions like the time it would take to move the ships, offload the equipment, marry it up with Marines, and become combat ready would be 10 days, if I remember right. Pretty short period of time, actually. And so that was one of the things we were testing was, is that realistic? Can it really be done?
Mm-hmm.
Also in concept design, we had assumptions about the capacity and rate at which cranes could work and how fast you could offload a ship and all that. So one of the pieces that we were testing hard were how many of the assumptions were correct, which ones weren't, what was the right number. And then also just looking at ways as the forces conducted these offloads and all, what kind of procedures were they using that we could improve on and make it easier for them and faster for them. So that was sort of the purpose.
Mm-hmm. And can you give us any examples of what you did find that could be done more efficiently, or, assumptions that were challenged and replaced?
Yeah, let's start with the last one. So we had estimates in the initial design work and concept work for how cranes would work on a ship and how much material they could move in X number of hours. What we discovered when we started actually doing it was that the initial rate for a crane was about right. And so we would take and say, so this crane can lift X number of vehicles per hour. There's 4 cranes on the ship, so you'd multiply X times 4, and there you go. Well, what we discovered was that only some of the time could you use all the cranes on the ship. Either there wasn't the lighterage available to offload to, or the barge ferry that was sitting next to the ship you could start by using 2 or 3 cranes, but eventually the area that a crane could reach would become full, and so only the others could work. So we had to work through that and figure out. So over the whole thing, with all the constraints, what was the rate at which stuff could come off of these ships?
Mm-hmm.
CNA credits itself for being a data-driven organization. Well, we had data like you couldn't believe. We had data on how many vehicles came off of the ship, what vehicle it was, how long it took to get it from the hole to the lighter, how long it took to get it off the lighter. I mean, we measured time and effort across that entire process. And then between exercises, we would take all that data and we would use it to do analysis and build models that would give us insights that we could then share with the Marines and the Navy who were actually conducting these operations. So one of the Navy captains who was involved had watched similar kinds of operations and came to the observation that long, big barge ferries were more efficient than a short one. And that's absolutely true. But so his idea was, well, then I'm going to form the biggest barge ferry that I can possibly make. And you had several alternatives there's several sections of these things. So you could make them into various ways. And we told him, we said, no, we're going to tell you that's not the right thing to do, because when you take all of the center sections of these and put them all together in one ferry, all you've got left for the others are a power unit and a beach unit, so they're going to be short. And we can tell you from queuing theory that the queues that will form when you do that are proportional to the variance of the serving times. And what you're doing is maximizing the serving time, so you're going to maximize the queues. So this is not a good idea. And he said, no, I've watched it. I know damn well it'll work. And we said, all right, let's go for it. Well, that lasted about 2 days and he broke it up because we would go from all the barge ferries at the beach and none at the ship to all of them at the ship. And you could only service 2 at a time. So after a couple of days, he said, all right, I concede you guys had it right. But we were actually kind of glad to watch him do that, because, I mean, we had the theory.
Right.
But it's like, okay, I mean, theory's good, but sometimes you get a little surprised because there's a piece of this you didn't think about that you're gonna find out when you go exercise it.
Right, right.
So we were actually intrigued. And then much later in the sequence of things, we had one Navy officer who was very experimental. And so he said, I want to try and have you guys analyze every conceivable way we can hook all these pieces together and operate them. And so we did that. And so we were continually changing things. And the only thing we never talked him into trying was we tried to talk him into lashing 2 barge ferries side by side and operating them with only 1 power unit.
You gotta love the carte blanche there of, we want you to try as many things. That almost sounds like, go, child, enjoy the candy store.
Yeah. And the exercises, I mean, they fit particularly for development of junior analysts to teach them both the data collection piece and how CNA actually worked. I mean, that was probably one of the better enduring examples that I was involved in which it was easy to show and teach young analysts the CNA way.
It does, absolutely. Giving them a chance to practice the analytical values, testing and evaluation, data. Yeah, absolutely. I just want to wrap up by asking you, what is the limitations of these type of exercises?
We couldn't have all the ships in a squadron in an exercise, and we couldn't have all the Marines that would be associated with that squadron in the exercise. And all the pieces that would make it work. That's probably was the biggest constraint on the exercises. The other constraint was the ships in a squadron collectively had 30 days of fuel for all the aircraft and all the vehicles. And there was no way you were offloading fuel in one of these exercises. That's too much danger. So what we did was they also had 30 days of water. And so we would, in fact, offload the water in some of the exercises, not all of them. But water is a lot safer in an exercise. So if you get a leak or something goes wrong, you're not contaminating the environment.
Or risking an explosion or a fire or something like that.
Exactly.
Exercises are an invaluable tool to test and develop a concept. But as the saying goes, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. In December 1990, my next guest deploys with the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force to Saudi Arabia to observe one of the first offloads of the Maritime Pre-Positioning forces. So why don't you just start off by introducing yourself and telling me your current role at CNA?
Sure. My name is Mark Geis, and I am currently the Executive Vice President of the Center for Naval Analyses, which is the Department of the Navy's only dedicated federally funded research and development center.
Well, great, Mark. Thanks for sitting down with me today.
You bet.
You were one of CNA's analysts during Desert Storm?
I was a junior analyst and had been at CNA just a little bit less than 3 years when I took over as the field representative to the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force down at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina.
So you're actually the first field rep I've talked to who was assigned with the Marine Command at the time. Can you tell me a little bit about the culture of the Marines and what working with them was like?
No, absolutely. It was a once in a lifetime experience. Growing up, I had kind of been enthralled by the Marine Corps, and in particular, the Marine Corps operations during World War II, the Pacific Island hopping campaign. I had done a lot of reading on the Marines. So that's one of the reasons why I chose my first field assignment to be with the Marine Corps. And I'll tell you, having the opportunity to not only support the Marine Corps, right, the most elite military fighting force in the world, but also deploy with them was just a thrill of a lifetime. And I hadn't really ever worked with Marines prior to that. Most of my work had been more on Navy issues. So that was a new experience for me. But what I found was that they were so welcoming, more welcoming than I ever thought they would be. I mean, just think about it. I'm a young 26-year-old civilian that shows up at a command that's right in the middle of starting to plan for a deployment for a major real world contingency. Mm-hmm. And what they did was they really took me under their wing, right? They accepted me as one of their own. I think part of that had to do with the fact that I was going to actually deploy with them. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's some level of credibility that you get when you're willing to actually go into harm's way with them, despite the fact that you might be scared straight doing that. Mm-hmm. But they really did take me under their wing, make me part of their group. And throughout the deployment, it was just a fantastic experience, working with them, learning from them, getting to know the leadership. Once in a lifetime experience that really forged the future for my career at CNA.
You know, continuing on the theme of the Marine Corps, in one of our earlier episodes, we discussed how during Desert Storm, the Marine Corps kind of adapted from this primarily amphibious force to a force that actually operated in, landlocked areas and as part of ground invasions and things like that. I'm curious if during your career you've observed any of these changes and like what that means to the service.
Throughout my career working with the Marines, I've seen many different evolutions of, how the nation and how the Marine Corps thought about their role in the world. When we first started, you're exactly right. When I went to 2MEF, right, the Marines were the nation's amphibious force, focused on deploying for any size operation, where it be a smaller scale contingency or a larger real world contingency like they did in Desert Storm, Desert Shield. After Desert Storm, Desert Shield, right, we kind of saw them transition to a different kind of force focused on lower intensity conflicts, to some degree, humanitarian relief operations. And then ultimately, right, with Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom, counterterrorism operations, those types of things. But what they never lost was their focus on amphibious warfare, right? Fighting from the sea, being first to fight, an expeditionary force ready on a moment's notice to deploy and support whatever operation they were needed for.
You mentioned the Expeditionary Force. You worked on the pre-positioning forces concept, but as I understand it, your research in Desert Storm had to do with actually implementing this practice.
So, yes, I was sent to Saudi Arabia with the lead elements of 2MEF with direction from General Mundy, who was the commanding general of 2MEF at the time, to focus on the Maritime Pre-Position Force operations in support of Desert Storm.
And where were you stationed specifically in Saudi Arabia?
So I was stationed in Al Jubail, Saudi Arabia, which was about 130 miles from the Kuwaiti border and was the location of one of the largest piers in the world. So for obvious reasons, that was the location that the Marines and some of the other services chose to do the offload operations of their equipment and vehicles required for the fight.
Mm-hmm. And as I understand it, the later offloads did benefit from lessons learned from the very first offload. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. They were very different in a number of different regards. First, I'd say they were different in terms of the time that the Marines had to plan. So the first Marines that arrived in theater had about a week to plan for that offload. The Marines that I deployed with and the offload of MPS RON 1 had about 2.5 months to plan. So that's a significant difference in just the amount of time you had to plan.
I mean, fundamentally different.
Yeah, I think the second difference was time to execute.
Mm-hmm.
So for the first two offloads, I mean, you have to think about the environment they deployed in, right? While Al Jubail and the pier at Al Jubail was technically speaking a benign environment, as I mentioned earlier, the Kuwaiti border was only 130 miles away. And at the time, there was significant concern that Saddam Hussein was going to come across the border and invade Saudi Arabia.
Mm-hmm.
And with the port and pier facility only 130 miles away, there was a sense of urgency that was not evident during the subsequent offload that I participated in. So they had the threat of an invading force and the need to get that equipment off the ships and to the fighting force as quickly as possible. So you can imagine that caused a lot of chaos and confusion that we didn't have in the subsequent offload. And I think the third difference I'd say was that the first two offloads were the actual first time that the Marine Corps had ever truly exercised the MPS concept in full, offloading the entire squadrons. And there were a lot of things that they didn't know that they were going to encounter as they did this first offload in this kind of high threat, chaotic situation. For the MPS 1 offload, we had the benefit of the lessons learned from the first two offloads and 2 months to learn from those. And I think the 2MEF forces and leadership really spent a lot of time understanding what happened during the first two offloads to inform the planning that they did for the subsequent MPS 1 offload.
And what were some of the overall lessons learned from the first two offloads?
So I think the first one had to do with the offload operations themselves and how you set that up in a way that will allow you to have successful throughput operations. So the offload operations is simply getting the equipment off the ships. The throughput operations are sorting the equipment and then forwarding it and matching it up to the units the equipment goes to. So I think in terms of offload operations, one of the first things they found was the importance of being able to track carefully the specific pieces of equipment as they come off the ship, as opposed to waiting to identify what that equipment is and where it's going somewhere down the line, right? So right when it's coming off the ramp of the ship is the point in time where you really need to capture what equipment is coming off as opposed to waiting later. I think one of the other key lessons learned that really informed how we ended up doing the follow-on operation had to do with containers and how to manage container operations. Containers are the big 20 by 20 containers that were just stuffed full with equipment and supplies. And what they found is, right, you have to unstuff those containers, sort that equipment, and then get it to the right units. And the way the containers were stuffed made that an incredibly complex operation. And it was very chaotic. And they didn't have a process for sorting through the equipment in the containers, binning it to the units where it needed to go. Instead, it was just units coming with their own vehicles and just picking up stuff out of the containers, right? And that was not an effective way to get that containerized equipment to the units. So one of the key things that we focused on in the follow-on operation was how to conduct those container operations in a way that you could easily get the right equipment to the units and unstuff those containers as quickly and effectively as possible with control of the equipment, right? Knowing what had been unstuffed and where it was going.
That completely makes sense. And so the later offloads happens, the ones that you worked on, and lessons have been learned, things go smoother. But I have to imagine that there was still more to be done. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your key findings while you were working on it?
Sure. So the operation did go more smoothly, but there were still complications and a lot of lessons learned. I think what the offload of the MPS-1 squadron demonstrated is really the effectiveness of the Maritime Pre-Positioning Force concept in significantly reducing force closure time and speeding up the time required for deploying units to be combat ready. I mean, that was really the bottom takeaway. And that was really the takeaway from all three offloads, right? But this was a really effective way of speeding up the deployment of Marines and getting them combat ready. But there were some lower level, like process and operational lessons learned, which really shaped how the Marine Corps thought about MPF operations and how to execute them effectively in the future. So just a few examples. There was a heavy reliance or assumption about host nation support that would be provided in order to execute the operation. So for example, the Marines assumed that they were going to get additional drivers, right? Saudi drivers from the port that would help them move the equipment from the port to the different units, what they called the arrival and assembly operations areas of the different units. Also, they were going to be relying on Saudi personnel at the pier to operate the gantry cranes. What they really didn't account for was how the Saudis executed their workday. So just as an example, for the crane operators, what we quickly discovered was that their workday basically had a battle rhythm of 4 hours on, an hour off. Remember, these were 24/7 operations. Even though they had more time than the initial offloads, they were still pressing to get the equipment off the pier as quickly as possible, because even though it was a huge pier, this was 4-ship offload and there were Army offload operations going on at the same time. So they had to clear the pier quickly. And so having a situation where the Saudi crane operators were only working 4 hours on and an hour off simply didn't work for the battle rhythm and the op tempo of what the Marines needed. Likewise, they didn't have enough Saudi drivers, right? They were relying on significantly more. So it highlighted the importance of making accurate assumptions about host nation support and what that would bring to the table.
And some of that is like a cultural difference. There might be an assumption that nations operate in the same way that Americans do with the similar work rhythm, but that may not always be the case.
That's exactly what we found. That is exactly the takeaway. So you need to factor that into your planning. Another thing was just, the use of some of the new equipment that they were using. So this was really the first time for these offloads that the Marine Corps used what was at the time relatively new technology, right? Barcodes on equipment and barcode scanners to load up automatically data on what was offloaded in an automated way. And in the past, right, that had all been manual, right? You have a piece of paper and a pen and a pad, and you write down what's coming off. Well, it turns out that they were surprised by some of the challenges that they faced with this new automated system. And one of the simplest was something that you would think they might have figured out, but it just didn't come up in any of the exercises. It turns out that the barcode scanners that they used to scan the codes on the equipment did not work well in bright sunlight. And of course, Saudi Arabia is the desert, and every day the sun was beating down. And so the scanners didn't work well. And on top of that, right, while the scanners had the ability to notify the scanner when the person scanning, when they had a good scan, The notifications came two ways. It was a light on the top of the scanner and an audible beep. Well, the light they couldn't see in the bright sunlight, right? You couldn't see it light up. And there was so much noise on the pier, right? There were trucks and planes and cargo handling equipment. There's no way they could hear the beep on the scanner. And so they really couldn't confirm whether they had a successful scan. Ultimately, they went to a backup plan, which was largely a manual plan for tracking the equipment and then loading it into the automated database. But those were some real challenges that slowed down the execution of the offload.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to return to something you said throughout that, which is things that you were unable to test for, right? You specifically mentioned, the conditions. And when we spoke to Bill Morgan, he did also mention a few other things they were unable to test for. And one of the primary ones he pointed out was just a question of scaling. They weren't able to have all the ships in a squadron for an exercise, and they weren't able to have all the Marines that would be associated with the squadron for an exercise. So based on your experience, do you think that these restrictions on the exercises, did those restrictions have an impact on the ability to implement this concept in your mind?
Well, absolutely. I think while the exercises were invaluable, they simply did not prepare the Marines for the complexity of offloading 4 ships at the same time in a single location, right? I mean, it's just as Bill said, it's scope and scale of the operation and the complexity of the operation. And I'll also note that in the exercises, right, it was limited. So if you had a 1-ship offload for an exercise, rarely did you offload everything on the entire ship. So oftentimes it wasn't a full ship offload. And oftentimes you just didn't exercise offloading certain types of things because it was either too challenging, too dangerous in that environment, or too hard, right? I mean, remember, for an exercise, once you were done, you had to put all that stuff back on the ship. And if it wasn't put on correctly, right, it had to go back down to Blunt Island for repacking. That's where all the ships were packed. So the Marines were actually very cautious about not messing up the equipment that came off the ships. So for example, very rarely did they separate mobile loads, which are equipment that was loaded in the beds of Humvees, right? To save room. You used every inch of space you could to load the ships. When they took those Humvees off the ships, for example, very rarely did they unpack the mobile loads. That would just create too big of a problem when they reloaded the ships and repack things.
I mean, absolutely, right? It in no way degrades the value of the exercise, which of course needs to happen to figure out how even this works conceptually at all. But at the end of the day, you're never going to be able to compensate for every single factor and the scale of it in an actual operation situation. And that's why it continues to be important for analysts like yourself to be involved in these things, even after the concept has been proven out in exercises, because there's always more to learn. There's always more that can be improved.
Correct.
Yeah. And, I just do want to return to something that you talked about that I think really captures the theme of how important this concept is that we've been discussing throughout this episode, which was that the Marines in so many ways are prepared to be the first force into a conflict zone, right? And to be ready to deploy anywhere in the world at any time. And having their equipment ready to go and deployed throughout the world to meet them there when they can be airlifted in fundamentally allows for them to do that so much more effectively than if their equipment needed to be packed onto the ship they were being transported on and moved with them.
That's absolutely correct. And what they call force closure, right? The amount of time between when you start your deployment to when you are combat ready. I mean, the maritime pre-positioning concept significantly shrunk that force closure time. I mean, cutting off weeks from how they would traditionally deploy, right? Where they load the amphibious ships, the Marines would get on the ships, and then they'd sail over to wherever they needed to be. I mean, this was just a fundamentally different concept that had a significant impact on their ability to deploy more quickly, right? By having ships pre-positioned and not in CONUS per se, and then flying over the forces and the aviation assets to marry up with that equipment. I mean, it cut off weeks and weeks of time that it would take for the Marines to deploy. And it was really a game changer and continues to be a game changer, right? I mean, the Marine Corps continues to use the concept to this day in different forms.
Absolutely. Well, Mark, I want to thank you so much for coming on today. I think we all learned a lot. And thanks again.
Thank you.
Analysis in Combat is edited and produced by John Stimson, with executive producer Don Burrows. Theme music is by Edward Granga. If you enjoy our show, we'd love if you could give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in 2 weeks.